extraordinaire, the gemologist.
Welcome to the Geomologist Presents. Well, today is going to be a special show. I have a great conversation on the One Ring and Middle Earth role playing with Arlen Walker of Live from Pelham's Wasteland. I was going to add other things to this particular episode since I owe you an update on the games that I've been playing. Some of you really enjoy that. I owe you another Metal Minute, and I have an idea for a Metal Minute that should be pretty cool. And I owe you a reading from the Journal of Aput the Skinner. So maybe next time, we'll see. If I keep getting guests, well, you're going to get the guests because it's more fun to have a conversation with someone than to just hear me talk, in my opinion. So here we go. On with the show. Welcome, Arlen, from Live from Pelham's Wasteland. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Geomologist Presents. In this segment, I have a special guest, and that special guest is Arlen Walker from Live from Pelham's Wasteland. How are you doing today, Arlen?
I am doing well.
And like I mentioned earlier, probably in the intro to this podcast, that we're going to talk about role playing in Middle Earth. And mainly this is inspired, I think, by what I feel has been a successful set of sessions. Say that really fast after you've been drinking, especially if you have a lisp like me. Sound pretty funny, I think, because we've had several successful sessions of the One Ring role-playing game, the second edition of that game by Free League Publishing, and I think it's gone really well. I feel like it's captured the feel of Middle Earth to me, at least in that interim period of the late Third Age between the time of the Hobbit, maybe even including that time of the Hobbit and the War of the Ring, right? I think it's done
Yeah,
a really
yeah,
great job.
I think it's been a lot of fun. I think One Ring in particular is really good at that flavor of Tolkien, that the very much like a lot of the adventuring in The Hobbit, and also especially in Fellowship of the Ring more than in the other two books. I guess kind of in the Frodo and Sam stuff in Two Towers and Return of the King, but especially I think about like the hobbits on their adventure at the beginning of Fellowship, or even later after they have put together the Fellowship and they're just sort of wandering through Eregion, trying to get over the mountains and over to the other side. I think it fits that feel really well.
Right. Yeah, and it was like that, kind of uh society, not society necessarily, but the land in decline, right? There's like points of light. There's an earlier glorious age, right? Even in from Eriador, even the separation of Arnor and Gondor. Gondor is seemingly on its last legs. So much kin strife has really depleted things. There's a lot of trouble in the world, and I think that game, for what it does and for that time period, I think it works well. And and I and we could talk maybe a little bit mechanically how it does that. And just to let people know, I brought Arlen on because I think he's played like most of the the incarnations of Lord of the Rings role playing to some degree. I played a few, but not as many as what Arlen has listed, and we'll talk about those in turn, I think. And my experience is this One Ring role playing game, the first edition of the One Ring, and then the fifth edition version. There's two of them now. The fifth edition version, mainly the AIM, the Adventures in Middle Earth, done by Cubicle 7, and I've looked at and dabbled, read through some of the Lord of the Rings role playing 5e from Freely. So, um, and Arlen has had that experience and then some. So we'll get into that. I think, and you can chime in anytime. I think that I really I didn't know if I'd like the procedural and modularity of it. How it splits things up for in the first in instance between adventure phase and fellowship phase. and then an adventuring phase, the travel part, the conflict part, the social part, right, and then little spaces in between that you might need. And I think, I was kind of reluctant because you have you go through this procedure all the time. Um, I've always liked procedure, although some procedures seem more mechanistic than others, but I I feel like it works and it plays with it plays into the narrative and the feel of the One Ring.
Well, and one of the big changes that they did between first and second edition is making a lot of the procedures a lot more flexible. In first edition, in particular, there was a lot of like kind of preparation stuff that you had to do. So with first edition, like if you wanted to go on a journey to somewhere, you had to kind of map out as the GM the whole route on the map, and then you do kind of step by step each portion of the journey through the hexes. Um, with second edition, they made it much more like if what you want to do is just kind of head in the direction of something and just mark out your progress on the map, kind of more almost like a traditional hex crawl,
Hmm.
and therefore make it much easier to like divert if you want to like go somewhere else. You can just be like, oh yeah, you come across a trail that you didn't know was there before, and you can start heading south instead of heading east or whatever, and that's really easy to do in second edition by comparison to first edition. I think that helps I think a lot of the people who were turned off by just how mechanical it was in first edition. And there's some other things with first edition too that the like preparatory phase, one of the things you did with each mechanical phase of the game, each kind of subsystem, before you did a roll to get extra D6s to roll during that event. And it was always really difficult the thing is that rolling a six still had some effect, but there wasn't as much guidance. And rules as written, you had to choose to use your extra D6s before you made the roll. So it was hard to know like when you actually needed the boost for like an extra chance to do a little better at this thing versus other roles that weren't as important. So it was a lot more, it was, I think, a lot harder to just kind of immediately get into compared to second edition.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I do remember sort of that bit of an arduous process and mapping it out, and then uh, right, having to generate your sort of meta currency beforehand.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that helps it to transition quickly into like an encounter, right? And it's kind of an encounter phase, right? So whether, if you turn left at Albuquerque or Bree or whatever,
Mhm.
then you can there's a some there you generate what's the event that's going to happen, and it can lead to like an encounter or a side quest or whatever. So I think,
Yeah, much easier to improvise off of the events happening. And also, it's interesting because some of the adventures were written that way for first edition, that they would have that sort of thing where you're like the expectation is that the party is planning on heading to one place and then has an encounter and decides to go a different direction. And so clearly, like the designers understood that as a valuable thing that you could do, and I think hadn't a part of it is that first edition went through kind of a couple of different um, iterations of like printings, and a lot of the core design didn't change very much. And so I think that's part of what went on with second edition, which had kind of an odd publishing history as well.
right.
Um, but that they sort of took a look at all that and were like, oh, now that we've written all these adventures and all this other material for this game, here's kind of how to sort of take a look back at what we would have done from the start to use a lot of the kind of same principles. But second edition, I think, really is just basically a better game than first edition was. And I
Mhm.
liked first edition a whole lot, but I think One Ring second edition is a really well done game for what it sets out to do.
Yeah, there's a lot of material for first edition too. They've done some bundles of holding and some humble bundles in the last few years. So, and they usually do those about once a year or so, maybe every other year. Well, I don't know if they still can, but I know they did for a little bit. But but yeah, and I think it's like I was looking sort of last night because We watched War of the Rohirrim, or Hiram,
Mhm.
however you pronounce it. I'm sure different people from different places in the Middle Earth pronounce it differently. But anyway, so we watched it. It was pretty good. And then I was like, oh, I know I have some uh, first edition stuff on Rohan. So I looked it up and I was looking at the character. They have like this adventure. They have like two two books, right? They only
Mhm.
got to one in AIM. They only got to the location area book, but they have location area and adventure book for the first edition. And I mean, it's definitely backwards compatible, right? You could definitely adapt. And even on the character sheet, I'm like, oh, it's totally set up differently, but you can find where everything is going to go, which is
Yeah.
not so bad. So that's pretty cool. So I don't know, maybe there's a Rohan side journey quest in One Ring second edition in the future. I don't know,
Yeah.
or a one shot or Secret Adventure.
Yeah, well, that was one of the interesting things that they did for first edition is that they basically would do kind of a region book and then an adventure book in
Hmm.
that region. And so they started off because the basic book started off with the Wilderland stuff,
Hmm.
all of basically the stuff east of the Misty Mountains out towards Erebor that The Hobbit mostly covers in like
Right.
the second two-thirds or so. Um, and then they ended up doing like an Eriador book and then Eriador Adventures and then Rohan book and Rohan Adventures. I think that was the last
No, they
ones
did a
that the
Renavian too.
yeah, well, and yeah, they did the Erebor and Laughing at Live Dragons and
Hmm.
a bunch of different kind of. It was a neat way to do because often it was a little bit like the way that like Paizo does with Pathfinder books, where they would have like, well, here's a region, and then also here's a bunch of like new toys to play with in terms of mechanics. So like the
Hmm.
Rohan book has mounted combat, of course,
Right.
and then the adventures make use of some of those concepts, and so it's like, oh, you can do all the and then the big thing that they had was the Darkening of Mirkwood
Yeah.
campaign.
Yeah, that was like a
Um,
major campaign over a long roll of years that would
yeah,
incorporate.
yeah, it was presented as being kind of similar to the Great Pendragon campaign,
Mm.
that it was supposed to be about 30 years within the fiction, within the
Yeah,
world.
from like
Um,
2950 third age to,
yeah,
yeah, about
yeah, basically it's
2965 or so. Yeah, or longer than that. Yeah, to the beginning of the War of the Ring, right? I thought.
I think it's a little before. I think it starts a little bit after, like 5 years after The Hobbit, because that's about when a lot of the default stuff started,
Mhm.
and then ends 35 years later,
Mhm.
and basically answers like, why aren't there any armies that come from that part of the world that help in the main part of the War of the Ring that we see
Mhm.
in the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Yeah.
Um, and it's an interesting because it similar to the Great Pendragon campaign, it did kind of a thing where there's parts of it that are like core like adventures that you can just plug in and have the characters go on. But then you also had a lot of like, here's the list of like all of the things that are happening this year in the main
Mhm.
timeline and kind of which characters are going to become more or less important and which ones have kind of things that you should like as a game master, things that you might want to have as like rumors that show up of things happening, often kind of the distance that the characters aren't going to interact with, but could be aware of.
Mhm.
And also, it was interesting because that particular campaign, especially kind of the later parts of it, I felt like were influenced by a book by William Morris.
Mhm.
And William Morris was a British author who wrote a number of things of his own and also translated. He was one of the kind of first Victorians who translated a lot of like the Icelandic sagas, but he was a big influence on Tolkien himself. One of the things that he wrote was House of the Wolfings, which is a book that is kind of in some ways the inspiration for a lot of the Mirkwood stuff in Tolkien. Um, it is set in the what was described as the historical Mirkwood, which is basically the Black Forest in Europe in like
Mhm.
Roman times, as the Germanic tribes are sort of, whoops, I just knocked my mic, squeezed between the Romans and the Huns, basically in late antiquity. Um, but it has that particular book has a number of specific story elements that I think are really clearly referenced in the Darkening of Mirkwood campaign, which I thought was a neat
Interesting.
way to kind of pay homage to an author that Tolkien himself was a big fan of.
Oh, cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really neat. Yeah, I have to give. I kind of briefly looked at it last night as I was doing like a little dive into my PDF collection, from these titles. So it looked pretty neat. And they have like a Mirkwood book, and then the Darkening of Mirkwood campaign, of course, and then the Wilderlands, and then they even have like an Erebor book and location. They had a Lake Town book. So yeah, pretty comprehensive, which I thought was really neat. So
Well, and there's some cool, it's unfortunate that we didn't, so the publishing history I kind of alluded to. Cubicle 7 published One Ring first edition, and we're planning on publishing second edition. Um, and nobody directly involved, aside from the people directly involved in the project, has kind of found out exactly how it happened. But it sounds like we're pretty much ready to like go to the printers. Like they were having pre-orders available for second edition
mhm.
when they announced that they weren't going to be publishing One Ring second edition.
Wow.
Um, and then Free League ended up um, having that particular publishing um, line. And so it was kind of an interesting, but it's interesting some of the things that they talked about wanting to publish. And of course, now part of the issue, I don't think that they have been able to sell any of the first edition content at all, because of the
Mhm.
way that I don't think Free League has been able to sell any of that.
Right.
Um, but like they talked about, so one of the ideas that they had, that I thought was really cool is they were going to do a book called Errantries of the King, which is Aragorn in Gondor before the events of the Lord of the Rings. In the background of the story, there's a lot of stuff that he does in the world before the Lord of the Rings
Right.
itself, including leading a fairly major like Gondorian invasion of Umbar that becomes important in the actual War of the Ring because that's part of why they're a lot weaker and are vulnerable to the ships being taken over. And so I was really excited for that, and then it doesn't look like we're ever going to get to see any of that material in the near future, at least.
Yeah.
Um, but it's interesting the way that they have also kind of shifted the like the style of the things that they're doing also, because like they did uh One Ring second edition core book, and then basically a bunch of stuff that is kind of more first adventure sites mostly, and then this kind of book of adventures in Eriador, and then the Moria book most recently. And so
Right.
that's kind of a combination of adventure site and adventures,
Mhm.
and also like geographically connected to all that. So it's kind of interesting the way that that has shifted.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe they're going to do something like that next. Because right, so they did have a towards the end of first edition, it does look like they had I'm looking here. They did have an Erebor. No. Did they have an Arnor book? They had a Ruins of the North book.
Yeah, Ruins of the North is the adventure book for Eriador.
Okay. Did
Um,
they have a Oaths of the Ritter? No, Oaths of the Rittermark is an adventure book for Rohan.
yeah.
So I'm pretty sure they had they had anyway, Tales from the Wild. Huh, interesting. So you think that's Ruins of the North? I have two Ruins of the North. One's the maps and one's the other. Yeah, that is
Well, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how if they end up. I assume that they will expand to other parts of the world of Middle Earth, um, as they produce more material for the second edition line.
but I
But
think
it'll
the
be
Ruins of
interesting
the
to see what
North
they
is
do.
like the adventure stuff for like the Ronavian book. Seems like I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
I don't think so. I think that is the Arnor, Ruins of Arnor stuff, basically.
Okay. Huh, I don't know. So and then they almost did like one for one. Like they're doing the same thing. And I don't know, maybe that's sort of now. So it looks like they did all the One Ring stuff and they did the AIM stuff, right?
Hmm.
And then the AIM stuff they didn't get to everything.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that they didn't adapt into 5e before they lost the license.
Right.
And then of
And
course
what?
now also that's a contentious thing because of all the stuff with the OGL versus other
Right.
licenses. But
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. So now they're doing like publishing wise. I'm sure this is exciting podcast information for everyone. But publishing wise, it looks like they're doing it at the same time, right? They're doing it concurrently. So which
yeah.
maybe works a little better. So interesting. Cool. Yeah. So I think, how do you think combat in the One Ring, the new one, is streamlined?
Yeah, I think it works
Because that's
well.
the next phase, right? After the travel stuff,
Yeah.
then you have the encounter phase.
I think so. Like I said, in the earlier versions, when you had this like preparatory system, you had a similar thing for combat. Every character would roll battle as combat was joined, and that would give them extra d6s to use in combat, kind of
Mm.
similar to the way that Hope works now.
Yeah.
Um, and similarly, it was just unwieldy. It's one of those things that it was a kind of another meta currency that everybody had to keep track of that also was not. I think that's one of the things with meta currencies is that um, how much kind of overhead you have to use to keep track of them should be directly related to how useful they are, right? That what feels annoying is when you have to keep track of something that doesn't feel like it makes a big change to the game.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that that's part of why some of those simplified things worked. But I like it. I think the only kind of iffy thing about combat, and it was a kind of an iffy thing in first edition also, is that armor is not very powerful
Mm.
because of the way combat works by endurance loss normally. And your armor is only really a factor when you take a piercing blow, and then you have to roll what is basically an armor save to not be wounded. Um, which is a big deal. But I remember that was a change that a number of people made for first edition was to have basically to add like a not an armor save, but to do like, yeah, if you're wearing like metal armor, you take one less endurance loss on every hit or two
Yeah.
less if
So
it's really heavy to kind of push for something that feels more like a traditional game where it's like, yeah, wearing heavy armor when going to into battle feels like a bigger deal, basically, with
yeah. So
that.
like having a DR, a damage reduction on endurance as well as having the armor save. That's possible. That's pretty
Yeah.
easy to do. So maybe
Yeah,
it's
it's
something
really
you could
easy to
think about,
do.
right? Like,
And it's a
for leather armor, it's like one. For chain, it's like two. For I don't think there's anything heavier. I don't know if there's a.
yeah, there's basically in second edition there's four levels of armor, and I think
Mhm.
what people mostly did was basically starting with your kind of lowest level metal armor was -1 and then -2, and so it would be essentially a level 3 armor in second edition would be 1 DR, and a
Mhm.
level 2 armor would be 2 DR.
Mhm.
And that's an interesting way. I think in the trilogy, Tolkien is really explicit that Gimli is the only character who is wearing real armor on the
Mhm.
adventure.
Mhm.
And so I suspect that part of the logic of the mechanics here is that, okay, well, we don't want metal armor to be too attractive because then you end up with everybody, looking like fully armed knights as they march through Eriador, and that's not really
Right.
the feel.
Mhm.
Um,
Not at all. Right. Yeah.
but it also, and on the other hand, when they get to Rohan, Aragorn and Gimli pick up real armor and put it on and are at Helm's Deep. Very similar, in fact, to the scene in the movie, if you remember, that Vigo is putting on heavier armor and Gimli is messing with a chainmail shirt and all that
Yeah.
sort of stuff. And there's a scene that's similar to that in the book that's funny. That's once they have gone and rescued Theoden from the influence of Saruman, and they say, "Hey, you should pick out some armor because we're going to go to war." And Aragorn and Legolas both put on armor on top of their other clothes to be ready for fighting. And so I think you
Yeah.
know, basically, I think it would be cool if you had a reason to have that. It's kind of the issue of like in D&D where there's not really a reason to armor up anymore because you wear the best armor that you can handle
Hmm.
nowadays in modern D&D. And D.
Right.
And similarly, I think it would be cool to have that sort of feeling of like, oh, we're about to go into battle. Let's put on like the good
The
stuff
good
because
stuff.
we don't
Right.
want to march wearing that, but having that for a big battle is a smart idea, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Even the hobbits like Merry and Pippin get armor too, right? So,
Yeah, or like the dwarves of Erebor in the Hobbit itself, right? They put on armor when they're ready to go fight
or
at
in the Battle of
the
Five
Battle of the Five
Armies.
Armies, right?
Right.
And they're armored up in the best stuff that Erebor has, basically,
Yeah. Yeah.
is the whole
Yeah. And
idea. So
that's what makes sense. Like, every day, what you're wearing every day on the march, through the wilderness, dealing with encounters versus now we're going to war type of thing. That's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
I think that'd be pretty interesting to play out or to see how that would work. And maybe it does. Maybe like over time, I don't know, or maybe there's opportunities like in through
Well,
the
and if
course of
you
adventures or
yeah, you can
through the
also
narrative.
one of the things you can do is you can get upgrades to your armor, and so you can make it have essentially less weight
Hmm.
for relative to your endurance loss and stuff like that. And so that can
Right.
be another way to do something with that concept.
Hmm. That's cool. Yeah, and then the other thing that happens during the adventuring phase is the council stuff. So that I feel like was still in the old edition, in the first edition.
Yeah, councils are probably the place where it works, I think, the most similarly
Hmm.
because it was the same kind of phased setup where you have an introduction phase, and then you have a series of talkie-talkie sequences, and
Hmm.
based on how well you do across the combination of those, you get a result. I think councils were a lot harder in first edition in a lot of ways, um, just because the way the numbers worked out, it felt like it was difficult to get a particularly good success on a lot of councils. But I
Yeah.
like councils in both versions. I am one of those people that likes rules for talking,
Hmm.
and roll to talk, and not everybody but does. But if you do like those sorts of rules, I think that the councils work pretty well.
Yeah, but what I think is fun is like right, we'll see what is your approach, what are you going to do, and then that kind of I think leads to the narrative part of it. And then we say, okay, well, let's use this particular skill for that. Right. So that I think that's maybe more akin to like Powered by the Apocalypse. Like the GM says, okay, what is your approach? What do you want to do? And then you have the role at some point after the talkie part. So if someone wants to
Mhm.
engage in that role playing aspect, which you guys tend to do in our game, maybe that's why it's running so well. You and Amy both, then we get to the role, at some point. And then that lets me decide, narratively whether I think you use your distinctive feature. I think you get a bonus dice because of this or because of what someone said. So I think that's kind of fun part for me too, is right, you're rewarded for that, for going above and beyond. And I think it's flexible enough that you could add that aspect into that part of the game. Yeah. So
Yeah.
so fellowship is a different phase, and that's like the where you recover like after traveling and losing all your endurance and becoming fatigued and uh close to despair, which is sort of part of the shadow and corruption mechanic. Then you get to go home and somewhere safe and relax for a little bit. And
Yeah. And there was a fellowship phase in first edition, but fellowship phase, I think a lot of the changes that they made between first and second have emphasized like having a lot more kind of active changes in the character. First edition, like the way it was really hard to get Hope back and it was really hard to get rid of Shadow. And they've made that a fair bit easier under the expectation that you get more Shadow and you use more Hope in the new version. And I think that's another change for the positive because it really is a lot more engaging, right?
I think so, yeah. The way
In
that
the
I think I
other.
really like the way the shadow mechanic works, and I think, your character having accumulated some shadow already has like a scar to commemorate commemorate that, and I think
Yeah,
that
it's a
works with the like if you see the progression of characters in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, I think that you could see that. You see the influence of shadow and a change in people. That's kind of like it was kind of funny watching the War of the Rohirrim because like I was like we're like Amy and I were picking out, oh, that's what's happening here. There's like some corruption or well, shadow
mhm.
it's called. This looks like some shadow influence, or it always seems it's not overt, but it's like a there, like a
Yeah.
subversive influence, which I think is great. And I like how there's some overt stuff that has happened, sure, when you get like the attention of the eye or whatever, but it's more like subtle, and I think that's just kind of neat,
Well, and I think
and it
the
accumulates.
yeah, it accumulates, and the One Ring does a good job of capturing what I think is the very kind of Tolkien style assumption about kind of what shadow is, um, which is partly evil, but it is also like the basic like difficulty of engaging with a world that like in the book, I think there's a lot, especially with like the scouring of the Shire, there's a lot about like, well, the hobbits aren't really evil, and they don't really have much shadow at like the start of the book. But that's because there's somebody else taking the shadow for them, basically, right? That the Rangers have been protecting them from the outer world. And there's a sense of like, well, there's a sort of inescapable quality of being kind of changed and perhaps even harmed in some sense as one engages with a larger world that perhaps is not so concerned with their well-being. But that is also kind of necessary, right? That's just like part of the right, the hero's journey. That's what growing up is, all of that sort of stuff. And I think
Hmm.
One Ring captures that really well, that your character is going to get shadow and is going to be marked by being engaging in these heroic things, but that's not kind of just a bad thing, right? There's a great way where it's like, okay, well, yeah, the shadow is bad, but this is part of what it means to be heroic in
Hmm.
this type of story, in a way that I think a lot of other kind of fantasy tabletop role-playing games have evil as something much more kind of external and best to be avoided, and that is like I think about OSR games where like undead with level drain is like obviously you almost never want to actually encounter them unless you're in like the perfect circumstances to deal with them. You mostly just want to avoid that sort of thing.
Hmm.
And I think One Ring really gets into the idea of like, no, you don't just want to avoid all of these things. You want to deal with them because this is what's necessary for being heroic. It's just also going to cost you. And that's very, very kind of story gamey, the sense of
Hmm.
like we're playing to have fun seeing how your character comes to deal with the evils of the world.
Yeah, you confront it. It's like you almost have to. Like even our last session where, I think Amy's character came to the realization, I don't want to destroy you, but we have to.
Yeah.
And there are consequences too, right? Yeah, like her character has a nice wound to remember that by,
Yeah.
right? And
Well, and
people.
that's another, I mean, I think speaking of specific second edition, that Freely has done a really good job of capturing the sense that there's a lot of shadow in the world that is not directly kind of active Sauron, but sort of the passive existence of evil, for lack of a
Mhm.
better term. That
Right.
the adventures that our characters have been on, a lot of times the shadow things have been characters that were like good at one point who
Mhm.
have, because of their suffering, have changed and have not been able to kind of deal with the things that have happened to them in healthy ways. And that feels very Tolkien to me, the idea that like actually so much of like the evils of the world is just kind of people who have suffered and don't know how to get better, basically, right? That's like Denethor, that's like Theoden when he is corrupted by Saruman, that's like Gollum, that's all of these.
Helm Hammerhand, right?
Yes,
His the loss of his
all of these,
sons and
yeah, all of these
falls.
figures that are,
They even use the word despair, fell into
yes,
despair, and then he disappears, and then in the even in that movie they kind of like there was this whole in the thing and during the siege, right, that this ghost would go out and kill sentries, and that's part of the legend of Helm Hammerhand, right? That's referred to, and I think that's it's cool how they played that or they showed that to me in the War of the in that movie in the War of the Rohirrim, and because and why, because he's that's his outlet for
yeah.
despair to
Well, and
deal
I
with
think
this
that's
tragedy.
like very authentic to Tolkien's books and very authentic to what he sort of is getting at with the Lord of the Rings, right? I mean, in his like forward to the books, he talks about like this is a book that I had to write because all of my friends died in the First World War.
Mhm.
Um, is very upfront about like this is something that has come out of a place of like suffering and despair, and trying to get better. And I think that's the One Ring does a really good job of making some of those elements mechanical and therefore kind of having a framework for engaging with that within the game.
And I think it makes it easier because it is during the gameplay. Like I'm thinking of another game that really gets into that sort of trauma, and uh, that like Delta Green tries to deal with that, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
The the connections you have, I can't remember what they're called, that you can, you know, uh, you have like certain touchstones or connections to deal with the horrors and the bad things that you see, right?
Yeah, yeah, you have your set of NPCs that
Yeah.
are like the people that you have relationships
But
with
see, that ends up
outside
being
of.
so you never in gameplay, you rarely engage with that. It's always like in between stuff. So if you're playing at home with your friends and it's a campaign, sure, you'll get into that. But like a lot of times I play these Delta Greens at like a convention and you just use the mechanics of helping with your sanity. You really don't,
Yeah.
there's no after effects. But I think
Yeah.
that's what's I think is kind of cool the way this One Ring is set up, and like you just spoke to, right? Uh it's there. You deal with it, and it helps your it's development of your character, and I think that's fun for a person who's into sort of the more narrative aspect of a game. I think to some degree we all have like this what is that the gamist narrative simulationist type
Hmm.
of tendencies, and I think that really appeals to a narrativist. But then the gaminess of it is like, well, you have a procedure for this, so there's a process to get to that narrativist location, I guess, or
Hmm.
experience, maybe. Um, I don't know. I don't know. I haven't seen a battle system for this game, but I don't know how simulationist it really is. But probably lowest on the simulationist, as far as I can tell. But yeah,
Kind of. I think it gets to an odd, I mean, I mean, I think what a lot of the sort of GNS stuff uh, this game, One Ring Second Edition, is probably the lowest on Simulationist, but also it gets into an odd place where I think the GNS people, when they were kind of coming up with this idea, um, like hadn't really seen very many games that are like, oh, we're going to make a game that is specifically like to create this kind of narrativist stuff
mm,
through gameplay. And I think that's what a lot of the sort of story games that have been developed since the early 2000s have gotten to is like, well, why couldn't you have a game that is gamist in the sense that all of these kind of game elements are present in the game, but also like structurally creates narrative out of engagement with the game
right,
elements. And
right.
so, yeah, I don't know how you would necessarily decide that One Ring stacks up, but
I just know it's been fun to play.
yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I've had a great deal of fun with this particular campaign.
And it's not to say it doesn't have rules that are challenging, because we actually had, I think in our the third session, our second actual gameplay session, we did step back for a new player, my wife Amy, and explain some of the rules so she could understand it better. So, there is some a learning curve to it, I would say. So
Yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, we've talked about in sessions how there's a lot of kind of small things that are relevant to how the game plays out. Like we've talked about the different like special things you can do in combat and when you do those and how you do those. And those, a lot of those, I think, model the kind of things that we see in Tolkien fiction well, but it's also a real like there's a sort of player skill element of
yeah,
knowing,
there's a
well, here's
mechanics
how I
to it.
translate what I want to do into the game mechanics to
Hmm.
be
Hmm.
able to do that well.
Yeah.
Which is I mean, I think that's probably the place that people who get frustrated with this game or don't find this to be the Tolkien game that they like, that's probably the place that they bounce off the most is getting, especially in all of the ways that One Ring has these kind of story gaming or non-traditional structures. A lot of, I think, the earlier Tolkien games, I think about like MERP and the Decipher game, both mostly were kind of trad game structures with Tolkien-esque elements and statted up specific Tolkien monsters and statted up specific Tolkien cultures and things like that, and less of this kind of bespoke structure that you kind of have to wrap your head around to engage with, right?
Yeah,
So
to
yeah,
experience that sort of hero's journey. But that's not
yeah,
to say that, I mean, these earlier games do not have their place. I think if I ran a game that was kind of in a more heroic time period, right, say, late Second Age, during the Wars of the Witch King in the, early to mid third age, then I would probably use MERP because they have a lot of material to support that, and they have the really cool like old style maps to for all these places that when you get to the time period of late third age and the One Ring uh, set of games, then they're all ruins and
yeah.
they're like adventure location sites, not where the king of Cardolan lives or whatever. Yeah, and I also think that MERP has such a breadth of material. It's fun to look at and it's cool. And
Yeah.
then they also tackle places that so far haven't been hit on by the newer games, right? So especially Gondor in the south, right?
Yeah, yeah. The with with the stuff that didn't get finished for what was going to be Cubo 7 second edition, there's a lot of like Gondor and Harad and Umbar stuff that you could totally. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing is that in the books we don't see. I mean, we see a fair bit of Gondor, but we don't see very much of lots of different kind of parts of the world. Even thinking about like with in The Hobbit, we see some of Mirkwood, but we don't really see like Dol Guldur. We hear some about like, oh, Galadriel leads the White Council and they go and destroy it and all that sort of stuff. But
Mhm.
there's a lot of like places that we hear a little bit about in the book and then don't really see that much of. Um, and so there's interesting, places for adventure that haven't really been touched on. If you want to use, you know, One Ring itself doesn't have that much of that material published, at least yet. Um, but MERP has plenty of that. Or like I had mentioned, that Decipher did a Lord of the Rings game that came out when the movies came out, although it's not just the Peter Jackson movies, although it does have covers from the Peter Jackson movies.
Yeah.
And they've got some cool material for other parts and other flavors of Tolkien, like you were saying, that you could totally use a different game to also be a way to get at a different part of the world or a different era, right? Arnor back when it was still around, or
Mhm.
Gondor during the Kin Strife, I think is one that people talk about a fair bit. Or I remember there was somebody, I think maybe on Reddit, who was talking about using Burning Wheel for Second Age.
Mhm.
stuff. So they had like one character who's a Numenorian who's away from home and hanging out in like the Elven kingdoms, and then a bunch of elves, and they're fighting Sauron in like the very at the time of the Lord of the Rings, very, very ancient wars, kind of similar to the era of the Rings of Power TV show.
Yeah.
Um, and you could, make make like a an 8 life path burning wheel elf and be like, yeah, I'm gonna be a super badass
Right.
and
Like
do do all
Gil-galad
this crazy stuff. And yeah,
or
yeah,
Glorfindel. Yeah.
yeah, very much the kind of stature of characters in that era in the world.
Right.
Um, so,
Yeah, it's interesting. It just is a right. It's like playing like exalted in the first age and exalted in the third age. Right. It's like
yeah,
the powers are so ridiculously, different. So that'd be kind of cool. Yeah, I guess you could. I
yeah.
mean, you could do that. I did notice while taking a look through the MERP stuff, you just in as a background or trying to check things out to maybe use in our current One Ring game that they do have like a conversion to different systems. They have a
Hmm.
conversion to the like you get like a 2 to 12 system, so like a 2d6, you know, traveler type system. They have a conversion
Hmm.
to 3 to 18, so like a D&D. They have a D20 conversion system, so I guess you could convert things roughly to like the One Ring type of stuff, right? Since it's based
Well,
on the
and nowadays with so much of, I mean, obviously with traditional publishers, there's limitations based on copyright, but with so much fan content for all of these games that have existed for a long time, I think there's material that people have put together for a lot of stuff. I mean, even just for the One Ring first edition, I remember finding a bunch of really cool like things that people have put together. There was a whole narrative battle system that somebody put together that was like, hey, I really want to run something that feels more like the Battle of Helm's Deep and not have it just be, well, we're gonna, everybody has 100 orcs, you get to kill them one by one, that sort of thing, right? And there was some cool things that people had put together to be like, yeah, here's ways to handle different different situations that aren't really covered in
you
the
know.
core books.
Mhm.
And some interesting like rules tweaks, but also just adventures and material and all sorts of things that people have written nowadays. And I think especially because Tolkien's work is so popular that there's a lot of material out there if you want to do if you have almost anything with your kind of sights set on a particular Tolkien-ish thing,
Yeah.
there's probably a way to find somebody who has done something with it or figure out a rule book that has some material from it.
Yeah, didn't you say there's even like a Harn Master,
Yes,
Harn Master
a
Middle Earth thing?
fan-made system called Amber Quinta that we were talking about before we started recording
Yep.
that is built on Hardmaster among other things. I think it has a lot of stuff from Hardmaster. It might have some stuff from the Decipher game also because I think came out at a similar time.
Oh, neat.
Um, and there was like a choose your own adventure Middle Earth set of books that I think it might have something to do with that system also. That was kind of like an adapted version of like Fighting Fantasy, maybe. I don't
Mhm.
remember exactly. Um, but
Yeah,
then there's
that's
also,
cool.
I mean, even like I've seen there's a pretty good, some people will say it's Games Workshop's best game currently in publication. And in some ways, I think they're not wrong. But they did, when the Peter Jackson movies came out, they did the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, and then
Oh,
that turned
right.
into the Hobbit strategy battle game, and then now it's the Middle Earth strategy battle game. And I saw one, I think it was on a channel, a YouTube channel of somebody doing like, yeah, we're doing like battles are Middle Earth strategy battle game for the battles, and then all the role playing we just use. I don't remember which other system that they were using, but like, yeah, we just, in kind of similar to some other, like Lancer does a similar thing where there's two like very explicit kind of spheres of action, right?
Mhm.
There's crunchy combat, and then there's the talkie-talkie role playing stuff. And they were like, yeah,
Yeah.
we just use this war game basically for all the battles because it's really extensible up to a big fight.
Mhm.
And then we in talkie scenes we have some other system. I was like, oh yeah, that makes perfect
Wow.
sense.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great idea. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, it is a good game. A lot of the things that they took from that, they adapted to like their Age of Sigmar game, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, then they did skirmishing versus, because you could, in that game, you could do skirmishing with the little round bases, then you could put on a tray and make like ranked battles, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of neat how they do that. So, all right. Well, anything maybe you're looking forward to or wish to see in our current One Ring game?
Current One Ring game. I don't know. I've been having fun. I really like we've done basically two adventure
Yeah,
sites
two adventures, more or less. Yeah.
yeah, from Ruins of the Lost Realm. Um, and I've enjoyed that a lot. I think it would be cool. You talked about the Tales from the Lone Lands
Hmm.
is the next book, and I think there's a lot of, I mean, honestly, just kind of seeing more kind of interesting places and things. That's a lot of what I like about the One Ring system is
Right.
just kind of the sort of exploratory side of
Hmm.
um, wandering around in this interesting world. I think it'd be cool if we wanted to, we could go and do not even engage with that much of the Moria stuff, but just like, look around a little bit in Moria would be a fun kind of a side quest almost, right?
Yeah, there's paths to Moria, just depending. Like what I've liked about the books, and both um a lot of these games, I mean, so like Merp had like specific adventures like already published. This is the adventure, but a lot of their
Mhm.
stuff is just like sites also, right? They have that tradition where they have sites, and this is what happened here, this is what's going on here during this age or this time period. And I like that Merp did a lot of like this is what's going on in the mid third age, this is what's going on at the late third age, or what this looks like then. So I thought that was really neat. And of course they have like adventures, like I said. But in this new incarnation, right, they do have adventures, but it is really a kind of like locations. And that's what I like, is that it's pretty adaptable. You could see where the road goes ever on and where the road takes
Mhm.
you, right? You guys already they've gone from started in Bree, and now we're kind of we were at the foot to the like the southern Blue Mountains, and now they're in the Gray Havens. So who knows where we're gonna go next? That's pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm excited. I'm happy to do. I've been enjoying that game a lot, so I'm just excited to continue adventuring through Middle Earth.
And I guess any questions for me, maybe, or uh, ideas of what maybe you would like to run and with what in somewhere in Middle Earth.
I don't know. I'm not sure when I would next do something in Middle Earth. Um, because I've done a couple of things. I had what I thought was a pretty fun sort of mini campaign in One Ring first edition.
Mhm.
That the climax of it, the sort of last stage of the adventure was in the movie, if you remember, Aragorn is wearing the Ring of Barahir, and in the book that he has already given it to Arwen, he gives it to her as his engagement ring.
Mhm.
But it's the ring with two serpents with emerald eyes with crowns,
Mhm.
um, and it is a ring that has been passed down through the line of Elendil since before Elendil's time, um, way back when, like, you have Elros and um, the Erendil going to get the Valar to fight in the War of Wrath and stuff.
Mhm.
Passed long down, and is the possession of the last king of Arnor. And he goes to the Losoth, who are these people who live kind of further north
Yeah,
of
right.
Arnor. And Tolkien doesn't say explicitly what happens to it, but it is implied that when Arvedui, the last king of Arnor, he is in a shipwreck and is killed, but has apparently left the ring behind with the Losoth. And at some point, Elrond figures this out and sends somebody to go get the ring to bring it back so that he can give it to Aragorn when he comes of age, because Aragorn is raised in Elrond's in Rivendell in his
Mhm.
household, right? And so I thought it would be really fun it is implied that that happens much earlier, but I was like, oh, you could have that happen at like the era of just after The Hobbit that a lot of this stuff takes place. And so the player heroes went from Rivendell to the Lostoth and negotiated for the ring, and then met a ring wraith who wanted to get it, basically, right?
Mm.
Who knew about this thing, and so ended up driving the ring wraith off and coming back and realized that Elrond does not actually have. He had been introduced as having three sons, Elladan and Elrohir and Estel, and of course Elladan and Elrohir are elves who are actually Elrond's sons, and Estel is Elvish for hope, and it's what Aragorn was under the assumed name when he was living in Rivendell. And so they
Mm.
come back and they give the ring to Elrond, and he says, "Actually, I'm not really your dad. You are, the heir of Numenor and all that sort of stuff." To 17-year-old Aragorn, and gives him the ring and says, "All right, time to go.
Cool.
Be the heroic character that we know and love from the Lord of the Rings." So I thought that was really fun.
That's really cool.
But I think I had so much fun coming up with that concept that I was kind of like, oh, well, I don't know what else I would do with this world now that, like, all of the other things don't seem like they would tap in quite so elegantly to all the things that I like about Lord of the Rings. So I'll have to think about what I might want to do in Middle Earth.
Yeah, I don't know. So I was thinking. I mean, I think like the movie I just saw. I was like, oh, I want to do stuff in Rohan, or and I don't know when I would want to do it. Probably like the same time period. But then like, oh, what about like I've been watching some YouTube stuff on the Lord of the Rings, and then it's kind of interesting what happens after the War of the Rings. So maybe even
Mhm.
Fourth Age stuff. How would that look like, and what would that be? That'd be kind of neat to do too. Either in Eriador, right, as they try to unite the old kingdoms, or what Aragorn does next after being crowned.
Mhm.
Especially with regards to like Umbar, Harad, etc. Because there's still
Yeah.
a lot of stuff that goes on, right? In the aftermath of the War of the Ring. So
Yeah, there's a lot of, and there's all sorts of, I mean, I think that's one of the like continual appeals of Middle Earth is that despite, like I said, knowing a lot about some parts of the world, there's all sorts of stuff that
I
we just
know.
don't know very much about. And, empty space on the map, all of the, like we know, Smog in famous from The Hobbit comes from the Withered Heath, and there's apparently more dragons there. But we
Oh,
don't see any, right? We don't see any other dragons in The Lord of the Rings.
right,
Um, and so you could totally just be like, yeah, we're going to go out and adventure in this part of the world that apparently has this kind of weird stuff, and who knows what's all going to happen, and have it be like, well, it's the feel of the Lord of the Rings, but it's something that is kind of totally unknown. And that's
right.
really cool to me, right?
And that's why I mean I know people dogged it, but that's what I thought it was cool about the. I thought whoever when they is conceived of the War of the Rohirrim, I know the main character is the unnamed daughter, right? That's in the tales. It's the
Hmm.
unnamed daughter of Helm. But so what? I mean, it's cool to see things from their perspective, and they got the broad general sense of everything. They got the highlights correct, right? What how Helm unintentionally caused the war, and the bad guy, and the sons that died in the and then the siege, and then his Helm's nephew saving the day, right? So it was kind of,
Well, and
and
there's a lot of,
they added some interesting elements that could be plausible. you
yeah,
know
and there's a whole kind of underlying question in the trilogy, especially of um the kind of reliability of all of the things that have happened, and that it is presented as the writings of characters who lived through these
Mm,
events. And we all know just how much things can be distorted when
right.
it's even eyewitness accounts and things like that. And I think there's been some interesting. There was a book that I read a number of years ago, Kirill Yeskov's The Last Ring Bearer,
Mhm.
and it presents a version of basically the Return of the King and the events afterwards, that is totally different, and that imagines that Aragorn is a usurper and he has come up with all of this complete nonsense about being the heir to try to basically steal throne of Gondor from the rightful heir, who is Faramir, and has, Mordor is basically modeled on the Abbasid Caliphate, and they're like scientifically really advanced and have been like pushed out into this wasteland, but they figured out how to irrigate the desert, and so they're able to support themselves, even though they've been pushed by the heirs of Numenor into this wasteland. And the elves live in this like insane. They're not they're not good, right? They're like deeply manipulative and evil and are kind of pulling the strings of all of these different free people's forces to try to break down Mordor, because Mordor is special because Sauron is this kind of like Luciferian figure in John Milton's version of the mythology, where he's like, he's almost like a Prometheus character and
Mm.
is trying to give people a chance to not just trust the elves automatically, and the elves are totally manipulating that. And it's a really interesting kind of, unfortunately it's not that well written,
Mm.
but it's fan fiction, so whatever.
Yeah.
But it's a fun kind of concept of like, well, what's a totally different kind of interpretation of all of this material, right?
Mhm.
How do people in other parts of the world maybe think about some of the stuff that we see in the Lord of the Rings? And even the trilogy has little bits and pieces, right? Like when the Haradrim are defeated at Pelennor Fields, and there's a one little line about how they, never found out what happened to their forces there. They just had the rumor of the war, and the fear of the men of Gondor and Rohan. And it's kind of an interesting, like you could the implication of this part of the world that is far enough away that they don't actually really know about all this other stuff, but they have some sense of all of that. And there's really cool,
Mhm.
I think that, like I said, that's so much of why I think Middle Earth feels really interesting, is this idea of just how much of the kind of the world is out there, and
Yeah. Yeah. So
there's
many
like
things
the
that,
real
I mean,
stuff.
there's right. And I guess the fun thing is too, right? The time is so broad, right? It's a lot of time. And, we don't know. I mean, I guess nowadays, right, the detail of day to day, but how much do you remember? Right. So, it's so much time that you could put anything in there.
Well, and there's
So,
such odd, like fun little things that you could do, like even a full campaign about. Like in the Lord of the Rings, there's a whole thing about the Hobbit's pipeweed,
mm,
right? Is one of the first sections talking about hobbits, and then about the pipeweed, and that the hobbits think that it's the kind of core thing that they have invented, right? That they have invented the smoking of pipeweed, but Pippin has figured out, and Merry and Pippin have figured out that actually it probably didn't originate in the northern climate. It's because it grows much better in Gondor,
mm,
even though they don't smoke it there. And so the kind of implication, you could do like a whole campaign that is just adventuring and is tied to like bringing pipeweed that grows in the southern regions up to the north, and becomes kind of a facet of how that world works out. And that would be kind of fun and interesting, and could, tie into all of the various kind of early third age stuff that you might do, where like, well, the kingdoms are still around, but they're not quite doing as hot as they did when they were like full on supported by Numenor, and
mhm.
all of that sort of stuff. And
Yeah, there's a lot of things, right? Like think about like Dol Amroth, right? So they don't
yeah.
really talk about that in the movies, but they send forces to help Minas Tirith. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on that I mean, a lot of us and a lot of people have not read the books. Let's be honest. They understand the world of Tolkien through the movies, whether they're the Rankin and Bass cartoons way back, or Peter Jackson stuff, or the Rings of Power.
Mhm.
So you know, uh, there's a lot of nice little things that are sort of touched on but not explained or not detailed in the Lord of the Rings itself, in the Hobbit, right? Um, which I think is kind of neat. I mean, like so even like this whole idea, the whole like back. So they showed in the Hobbit, the trilogy of Hobbit movies, but if you just knew about Rankin and Bass, you wouldn't know the whole history of why these goblins hate the dwarves. So, this particular clan of dwarves so much, right? And that's
Yeah.
explained kind of in the beginning of The Hobbit, right? I mean,
Mhm.
like almost like as a flashback. So, or is it? It's like actually when you get to the Battle of Five Armies, like, oh, this is why this is going on. There's this whole like flashback about why this is going on.
Yeah, yeah. In the book, it's very much like the goblins show up, and then Tolkien's like, "Oh, and
Here's
here's all of
why.
the stuff that has been going on in the background that Bilbo didn't know about until
Right.
now,
Until
because
now, because yeah,
this
it's
is
just
when
from
he
his
asks
point of
about
view.
it, basically." Yeah.
Yeah. So
Um,
stuff like that would
but
so
it's
that could be fun, if you're that could be fun to explore that, right? So and
well, and
what's
there's all sorts of, I mean, there's interesting. Um, I think there's also cool stuff you could do. Like one of the things in um, the Tolkien stories is very much the kind of not sentience, but the personality of objects, basically, that these magical objects
Mhm.
have a sort of self that is very
Animals too,
much.
right? Animals too, right?
Yeah. And but that in particular has a lot to do with Anglo-Saxon literature,
Mm,
and their riddles that are all like I am an object, but it's all in the first person, and so it's the object that is speaking and describing its own kind of existence and things like that.
mm,
Um, but you could do something interesting if you wanted to cover like that broad space of time. You could do like, well, here's the sword fighting in like the Battle of the Last Alliance, and then here we see it in like, it's in Gondor, and then here's later on during like the Kin strife, and then
mm,
here's, it's being worn by a ranger after Arnor has fallen, and then here it is, he's, one a new ranger who's like a member of the Grey Company who's bringing it to the War of the Ring, and do kind of like flashes into this very broad story through the perspective of. You could also just do that with an elf, I'm realizing, right? You could just have an
yeah,
elf who lives all that time too.
yeah,
But that could be, maybe that would be an interesting way to do it also, right? If you had a party and you had one
yeah. You
character
could do a
play.
great like I could do that. Just give me some great ideas for our campaign. Could do a great war story with your elf character
Yeah, yeah, you could have an
or
elf.
the elf character sword, and I have a
Yeah.
hint of that with the Amy's character's new little dagger, right?
Yeah, yeah, you could
So
have yeah, well that would be an interesting way to do it also. It's if you wanted to do like you had a party and like some of the people play new characters and one of them plays the elf character and it's set, several hundred years in between each time. And so you have
yeah,
one person who knows sort of the backstory of the party and the others who don't, and they have to figure out based on
yeah.
that.
You could do
That
it
would be
with the
fun.
Rangers of the North too, right? So because
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
longer lived. Yeah, that's
yeah.
pretty cool. Yeah, some great stuff. Anyway, I don't know. We could talk about this for hours and hours, I'm sure, but let's
Yeah.
wrap it up. Thank you so much, Arlen, for coming on and discussing the One Ring and role playing in general in Middle Earth. I think we've given our listeners a lot of inspiration, I hope. We can't run all of those ideas as much as we would love to, Arlen and I, but there's plenty of ideas out there and multiple systems, and we have touched on a few, and I'm sure you can find more. And we didn't touch on some very much. So yeah, whatever system you like, we've been enjoying the second edition version of the One Ring by Freely Publishing. Again, that's the inspiration for me having Arlen on. But hey, play whatever age you want and whatever system you want. But I think I mean, it's a touchstone for all of us in this, who love to play fantasy role playing and the Lord of the Rings. So check it out. And if you don't like Tolkien, well, I can't help you. Thanks so much, Arlen.
Yeah, of course. It was great fun.